Okie doke. So, in order to talk about, in order to really crack open the conversation about our visitors and how to kind of get to know them so that you can manage them sustainably with a high excellence in the direction of connecting them with those opportunities that they're looking for, those motivations that they have to do it. Let's use Canal National Historic Park, which I'm going to refer to as Potomac Gorge, because the Potomac Gorge runs through Canal National Historic Park and is the physical resource upon which the cultural and historic resource of the canal is all about. Okay, so again, just as a quick reminder, we're talking about visitors because this is 50% of the reason for existence for any park service. It is somewhat less than 50%, but it is still a number one tier class reason for the existence of Fish and Wildlife, United States Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, IDNR, Green Earth Incorporated, Outward Bound, and so on and so forth, right? Public, private, every size, every scale, everywhere. Visitors are half the reason or more for the existence of them, right? They're raison d'etre. But these visitors are constantly changing, right? Boomers are dying off these days. Boomers were, in their millions, responsible for what was called the golden era of forest and outdoor recreation in the United States. So they were born post-World War II. They were about your age starting in the 1960s. And at that point, the graph on visitation at your national park, most likely, unless it was established after 1960, the graph is almost vertical for visitation growth in the 1960s and 1970s. In the 80s, it starts to level off at a lot of places. 90s and 2000s kind of plateaus for some places. But they are now getting old. They are retiring in massive waves, which is creating a lot of job opportunities and openings for you to backfill them as they are starting to age out. And the other reason we're really landing hard on getting to know our millions of visitors, at least by classification or grouping or characteristic, is that in millions, they have the same force as water, right? The force that carved the Grand Canyon, the force that eroded the Appalachians from larger than the Himalayas to, 5,000-6,000 feet at best over the course of 2 billion years, right? Humans, we leave marks, right? So we are constantly inventing new ways to do stuff. If you're familiar with the old Red-Green show, if they don't find you handsome, at least let them find you handy, right? So let's bolt some tractor tires onto a Suburban or a Bronco and go swamp tractoring. So put a new kind of tire or wheel on a regular consumer vehicle, and now you can go into a completely different kind of a place because there's enough displacement on some of these to actually float the vehicle. You can drive this through literally any depth of swamp. And so at Big Cypress, which is a natural area kind of on the Florida-Georgia line, but has nothing to do with the band, people did this so much that they altered the overland flow through that swamp, through that bog. Swamp, not a bog. Because their tractor tires were cutting 4 to 6 foot deep incision slit trenches, not in the direction of very slow, swampy overland flow. Like an inch an hour would be a typical flow rate. They started to divert all of that water and kill the entire ecosystem down watershed because it was starting to dry out and so forth, right? And the way that we figured that problem out was that NASA called up the Land Management Agency and was like, hey, we're seeing some bullshit from space. Is anybody dealing with this? And the Land Management Agency was like, oh, no, we'll take a look. And indeed, some unmanaged swamp tractoring, swamp bogging, it's called different things, was creating problems visible from 150 miles in space, right? So most of our largest human structures in all of history, aside from like the Great Wall of China, not visible from space. Recreation impacts, visible from space. That's a problem. That's on our watch, right? So constantly changing and powerful. Like the decisions that you make as the ranger affect stuff like this because these things affect everything else. All right, so Canal National Historic Park is this narrow strip of green on both sides of the Potomac River. We have the Virginia and the Maryland sides, so two different states managing each bank. The federal government manages all flowing water in the United States. And this is downtown Washington, D.C. Here's the west end of the mall with one of the Smithsonian's in kind of the fine print down there at the bottom. So the cherry trees are right here. If any of you guys have been to the National Malls, it's this end of it, out towards the water. And this is over 100 miles long. So it's a real thin ribbon of a national park, as well as a National Historic Park, but we would call it a national park for broad purposes, okay? This is what it looks like on the ground. This is a built canal, which George Washington, you may have heard of him, helped design this, helped kind of get this set up and financed and so forth. And then there's a towpath where horses, mules mostly, would be roped to essentially a flatboat barge and pulled along this for hundreds of miles to try and get across the mountains to the inland, to get traffic and freight inland of the mountains away from the coast, right? Before we had trains and stuff like that. Trains aren't going to show up for another 70 years when this starts getting underway, okay? But this is right next to the most powerful city on Earth. There's a lot of neighborhoods that push right up against this. It's a national park site. And it's a dog walking park for a lot of people because their house is like 100 yards from the outside border on one side. This park is as narrow as 500 meters wide in places from edge to edge. It's a very long, thin ribbon, so it's got a very high edge to interior ratio. For those of you in the environmental studies concentration or coming out of the geography department, you understand, or from our WAMCON specialization, the edge to interior ratio is a big deal ecologically for wildlife, right? This is all edge. It's no interior, right? All bark and no bite in some ways, ecologically. One section of this is Bear Island. Bear Island's like 2 miles long out of the 150 or so miles, whatever the total length of this park is, okay? So we hiked this on summer camp this year, for those of you who remember that, and we've got this Billy Goat Trail, Section A. It is a couple miles long. There are search and rescue efforts on this, not every day, but most days, because a lot of people show up wearing their chanclas or their tebas or whatever, and there's a non-technical rock climb called the Traverse that you have to go across, and sandals not really the right footwear for this kind of thing. But again, this is literally in a lot of people's backyards. So the visitation of this island goes up into orbit real fast, okay? And with that, we're going to get some experienced people, some very comfortable in this kind of environment people, and some folks who are not prepared. Also, this is a very highly channelized river, so looking back at, let's see, first photo here, right? These cliff walls, and in some cases they're actually vertical. These are kind of slabby, so they're relaxed a little bit back from vertical. 80 to 100 feet high. So when this river floods, it floods straight up. And there's 80 feet of depth on top of what is already here. Highly channelized river, highly captive river. And so when there's any kind of flood pressure coming in from up watershed, anytime there's a rainstorm anywhere, this goes up. And when it spills over the top of those 80-foot cliffs, it goes up and it goes sideways hard. And so the river can, at times, sort of attack this flat water, this dug canal, and do quite a bit of damage to the historic 250-year-old canal towpath stonework, all that stuff. It's an intensively weathered, intensively managed place. So the activities here are going to be pretty straightforward, right? So a lot of hiking, trail running. It's very, very popular to do what's called credit card bike touring, where you ride on your bicycle with your, probably not your tent, but like maybe your sheet set and your wine glass set, and you bike from Airbnb to Airbnb or traditional B&B to B&B, pull out your credit card, and they take care of the camping part for you with a nice, mattress, sleep number, they cook you breakfast and stuff like that, and then you're on your way to the next one, 50, 75 miles down the towpath the next day. So that's called credit card bike touring. It's a major activity here. Dog walking, like somebody taking their lunch break, they're working at the USDA headquarters in town, take the car out here, get a little bit of green space, some sunlight, some fresh air, back into the urban hellscape that is downtown Washington, D.C. And there's also, on those cliff walls, lots and lots of rock climbing routes. And then whitewater and flatwater kayaking, depending on the flood stage, or the CFS, the cubic feet per second of that flowing system. Pretty cool stuff. And it's all urban proximate. It's just right there. You can access this from anywhere in DC or any of the outlying bedroom communities very easily. So the social correlates of users for C&O Canal National Historic Park, this place, more than almost any other in the world, has some of the richest people using this place. Think like foreign diplomats. So high-level functionaries in the Saudi government. The government with a whole lot of money. They live a quarter mile from here. People with diplomat plates on their diplomat vehicles, meaning if they kill somebody drunk driving, they don't go to jail for it. Diplomatic immunity, right? Some of the most rich and powerful people in the world live right here, and they use this place. So things like income and typically associated with higher income, very high education level. There are a lot of PhDs, a lot of master's folks working in the defense industry around DC, in the contracting industry all around DC, and so forth. And at the same time as all of these sort of very high-flying people, we also have people accessing the Potomac River, going down 80 foot, 80 foot down and maybe 60 feet forward, so more rise than run, so over 100% slope on these little footpaths down to the water to dunk a fishing hook in the Potomac River, as dirty and disgusting as it is, and to catch their fish for dinner. Right? So we got the whole range here, more than at most other places. That's called subsistence activities. Not recreating, to feed yourself, to feed your family, as well as to walk your $10,000 clone dog if you're got more money than God. All right? The occupations involved here, more than at the park that you chose, are likely to be high-level professional. A lot of CEOs live in DC. A whole lot of lobbyists live and work in DC, right? It's that whole business of buying influence and so forth. So the age here is lower, maybe, on average, than the park that you chose. What is the average age of the visitors at your park? Here it's low because DC has a bazillion young folks who work as congressional interns, for example. Right? Most national parks have a relatively very high average age. Why do you think that is? Anybody speculate on why that might be? Brent?
It's expensive to take time off work and transport yourself.
Yeah.
Places like this.
So this land is your land, this land is my land, from et cetera, but it's more for folks who can afford to access it. So the National Park Service in the last 30 or so years has really started to cotton on to this idea of, oh yeah, so we have these amazing places way out where it's expensive to get to. What do we do about some urban proximate national park level experience in places? I bet there are some really good opportunities to do that. So they've leaned real hard into that with a couple of their most recent directors, including Fran Maynella, who was an amazing director of the Park Service several years ago. All right? So 2/3 of the visitors are between age 24, so post-college age, and 48. 40, maybe 50 is kind of the cutoff where people start getting real tired. So this is a place that is absolutely jam-packed with rock climbers and kayakers, and not just like slow, leisurely, I'm riding a beach cruiser cyclist, but folks in the whole GRS, like top and bottom spandex, you know? And they shave their legs and more aero. Yeah. Really, it's so when they get road rash, it doesn't get all scabby and nasty. But anyway, this is a young park. Other parks feel like very old parks. When you look out across the visitors, you see a lot of gray hair. All right? This place has some sex and gender typicalities that are a little bit different than probably your park. Some parks skew very male. Other parks are much more sort of balanced, male, female, intersex. Prefer not to answer all those different answers on the demographic section of visitor surveys. What do you think your park is in terms of just male versus female visitors? On average, if you're just picking a visitor at random as they're entering the front gate of your national park this semester, is it more likely to be a guy or a gal? What age are they, right? So these are all those different social correlates, just demographic variables, as we'd call them more generally, okay? Cool. This place tends to have more women. And that might be correlated with the age structure. Older generations tended to enforce, maybe low-key enforce, some gender differences or maybe even stereotypes for certain kinds of recreation activities, right? Rock climbing kind of used to be male-dominated. And then when you look at least competitive climbing these days, women are absolutely eating everybody else's lunch. It's amazing to see just the meteoric rise of kind of that change in demographics, a little bit more representational of everybody instead of folks who are just early at it. Okay? Other characteristics that we pay a lot of attention to in forest and park management are variables beyond the individual person. Right, so today we're mostly talking about, we're started off talking about just the specific trip characteristic, not the individual user characteristic of activity. Right? So activity is a characteristic of the trip. And trips are made up of the people. Right? So we want to know about the people. And then once they're on site, what are the specific characteristics of their trips typically? And what are the edge cases that are not at all represented in that typical slice of who's in your park? What are the edge cases, as those are called? Okay? So, group characteristics, building up from the individual person. Because if we just treated everybody in your park as an individual, that's a wildly inaccurate sense of what's actually going on. Okay? So, when we go to Ozark Scenic Riverways for our field trip this semester, we're going to be a class trip. So that's a very specific gender mix. It's a very specific and typically narrow age range of the people on site, right? 18 to 24. And because our group is a school trip, we're going to behave in some specific ways. And we're going to not behave in some other specific ways. For example, there is a non-zero possibility that someone is going to consume alcohol on our field trip. It happens almost every forestry field trip that I run. Right? People are going to people. Now, a family group is also people, but the characteristic age range is much bigger. And the behaviors on site, like drinking or not, going to be pretty different than characteristically a college-aged group, right? So the group type, group characteristics lead to big differences in what you're managing on site. So we want to have a sense of, for your national park, is it an urban proximate park that gets a ton of like elementary school field trips? The parking lot for C&O Canal, the big one by the visitor center, almost never is completely absent of school buses during the school year. That makes sense, right? There's several million people living in easy driving distance of this place, so why shouldn't kids be able to enjoy this place, right? And a bus full of elementary school kids are going to have very specific activities and that sort of specific bounded age range, and they're going to go to a limited set of places available in your national park versus, let's say, Brandon and his partner head to C&O Canal National Historic Park for a trip. That doesn't seem like a particular vibe, but maybe you guys decide to do that on your way to a show or something.
That'd be fun.
Yeah. So the two of them are likely to go to some pretty different places and probably a lot farther from the parking lot than a group of school kids who are there for 2 hours and they got a whole bunch of exhausted like teachers and teachers' aides chasing after them and trying to help them not eat goose poop. Okay? Trying, you know. So what's the size of the group? The size alone of the group determines a huge amount of stuff. In wilderness areas, if your park has any federally designated wilderness areas inside of it, group sizes are typically limited to 6 or 8 people. If you have a group of 40 people running around in the wilderness, the per person, the per capita amount of damage or damage rate is way higher, way higher. Each individual person leads to a total much larger amount of impact, trampling, litter, graffiti, whatever, injuries, versus a group of 6 or fewer. That's shown over and over and over in the research. Okay? We'll get to those cognitive processes, we'll lead to that later on. But for now, we just want to understand who are these people, right? What's their activity on site? How many of them in each associated group are doing it? If we have 10 groups of one person, we're going to have a very specific kind of wildlife disturbance patterns. And if we have one group of 10 people, totally different set and amount and intensity of wildlife disturbance impacts. Okay, so group size by itself is a hugely powerful thing, and you as the manager have a lot of control over group size. If big groups are a problem, say no big groups, right? Now your big group wanting to enjoy your national park, they're going to be pissed off, right? You as the manager are saying, you have this motivation, this goal, this drive to come to our park and do XYZ, whatever your activity is on site. And I'm saying, you shall not pass. Gandalf stop. And so they have to either break into smaller groups or not go. But maybe we have to do that sometimes for certain kinds of otherwise unavoidable impacts. Okay? So, group type, group composition. Is it an amorous couple? They might have a bunch of vegetation impacts rolling around together or something, you know, making the beast with 2 backs and agreeing with each other vocally a lot, whatever. Versus a group of retirees that are coming in on a big Greyhound tour bus, 80 of them at a time, right? Maybe the same number of people overall, so one bus full of 80 people versus 40 couples, totally different dynamics, and so forth. Status group dynamics is a characteristic of the group showing up on site. So status group dynamics are, how many of you guys are in RSOs? Cool, all right. Of you guys who are doing anything with RSOs, so student organizations, did any of you join that as a freshman or as like a first semester transfer student? Like just jump right in. Okay, cool, right on. Think back to that first like meeting you went to or first like activity that you went to with forestry club or whatever RSO it was, maybe sit, stay. And how there's like some upperclassmen and then there are like a couple other folks who are not really saying much. Maybe it's their first time as well. They might look a little bit more wide-eyed or whatever. So this idea or this label of status group dynamics is what are the internal social competitions and structures and struggles maybe inside that one group recreating at your national park. Some parks and forests have a lot of Greek letter organizations, fraternities and sororities who do events on them. So for example, the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest in southwestern Virginia, kind of near Shenandoah, but down on the lower slopes. There's a ton of universities in and around DC and southwest of that, UVA, for example, and they send a lot of their student groups to the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest to do like their weekend camping trips and stuff like that. It's like their Shawnee, right? So think about the freshmen and sophomore, the new folks on that frat camping trip, right? The pledges, the FNGs, right? Versus seniors who've been in that group, they're very comfortable, they hold a lot of social capital or power inside that group. This can lead to things like some of the freshman newbies in the group trying to do things to impress those high status members of that group. What could possibly go wrong, right? Throw in a whole bunch of 30 racks and it's a weekend, okay? So, what kind of group do you have and what sorts of weird dynamics are happening inside that group that are more tied to the group than the fact that they're at George Washington Jefferson National Forest Complex or on the Shawnee for the weekend, right? Like, this is where the whole trope or meme of hold my beer comes from, right? It's a social thing. Hold my beer. Pay attention to what I'm about to do. I'm about to do something crazy. I'm about to put on my clown shoes and try and entertain everybody to try and get a little bit more social capital, advance my status in that group. And maybe it goes really well and everybody's like, dog, that was sick. Ha ha. Have another beer. Or maybe they go, that's a trip to the ER. Let's get that thing pulled out of your abdomen. That's probably not comfortable, right? So status group dynamics can lead to some issues. On a wider scale, status group dynamics also, this would be like, for any of you guys who like to climb, if you've ever watched a video of somebody free solo and think to yourself, oh, I didn't even know that was possible. I bet I could try that. Maybe not free soloing El Capitan in Yosemite, right? What, 3,000 foot climb or whatever it is, without any protection, like Alex Honnold. But maybe at Jackson Falls, there's a 20-foot crack that is lots of fun, and maybe I could free solo that, right? But you get that idea from somebody that is high status in the larger group, not just the on-site activity group, but the larger group of climbers, and the group inside of that, free solo climbers. And you start at the bottom of that group, maybe someday you're the next Alex Honnold, getting celebrity endorsements, and really painful to watch, like awkward documentaries made about your life, right? Live your best dream, okay? And so forth. Next, what are the race and ethnicity? They are different things, or cultural groups, or subcultural groups. So big groups, smaller groups that your visitors identify as part of. This has a massive effect on how they show up, what they do, whether or not they show up in the first place. Okay? So in chapter 2 of your textbook, Studies in Outdoor Recreation, we'll see some of these race and ethnicity influences, chapter 2 and chapter 3. So for example, back at the last slide of our previous PowerPoint, like that was a percentage of people by activity that self-identified as white for that activity or place. Okay. As it turns out, there are some interesting and meaningful differences between how folks think about your national park based on how they came up. Right? So when I was in grad school, one of my classmates, also a master's student at the time, a gal named Rebecca, who identifies as black and white. She's mixed race, but primarily identifies as black, at least at that time. She tried to do a research project on why African Americans, black folks, melanated folks, whatever term you want to use, why they're profoundly underrepresented when you start tallying stuff like this up, right? So, 15, 16, 17% of the population, depending on where you draw that demarcation line, and way less than 1/6, 60%, 70% of the visiting population of most national parks. Now, why do you suppose that would be? This is a very sticky and tricky research question, but a very important one. There are millions of people represented by that just dry statistic. Why do you suppose somebody of one skin color or other subcultural group, so ethnicity might be more along the lines of like Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, whatever, versus non, so race, ethnicity, stuff like that, different lineage or legacy kind of stuff. Why do you suppose somebody from any of those groups other than white might show up more or less at a national park? Any ideas?
Well, I mean, I think you said on summer camp, but it was perception of who those activities were for and who they were aimed towards.
What? These are national parks. Like these are for all of us, right? Yeah, on paper. Okay. Have you ever self-selected out of doing something because you didn't see any representation of you or people like you in that thing? If you're nodding your head yes, that's part of what's going on here. If you're shaking your head no, I've never had to self-select out of anything, can you see how, or can you imagine how not everybody gets to enjoy that particular status automatically? So outside of the scope of forced and outdoor recreation, my wife, who is exceedingly beautiful and literally twice as smart as I am, she has 2 doctoral level degrees and I'm just one. She's a total babe. She's a turbo hottie. Like, I am all about the city. Our most recent date night was listening to Lord of the Rings audiobook and building the Optimus Prime Lego set. Like, God, guys, I felt so hard and I'm never getting up. Like, marry up, guys. Anyway, when I was in graduate school and when we were first married, I really loved to go running by myself at night. It's quiet, it's cooler out, I don't have to deal with nearly as much traffic. Most of the bugs are, sleeping for the night and stuff like that. It's just a much more pleasant experience for running. And my wife, who happens to be a first-generation Japanese immigrant, naturalized citizen, but her parents are off-the-boat Japanese citizens. She has never been running solo in her life, and she has no interest in running solo in her life. Ladies, why might somebody who is athletic and awesome and entirely capable of running, there's nothing physically holding her back from it, why might she not want to go running solo at night? Let's be honest, why?
It's scary.
It's scary. Why is it scary?
Other people are scary.
Other people. Right. Has anybody seen in like the last 2 weeks there was a viral sort of sociological thought experiment of would you rather be trapped with a bear or a man? The women overwhelmingly said they'd rather be trapped with the bear. And the men didn't answer the same way. So, how do your visitors believe about your park? How your visitors believe about themselves and their people, their self-identified people group. subculture, along the lines of ethnicity or economic marginality. Their beliefs hugely shape their choices. In fact, a lot of folks will never come to your national park, not for anything you've done wrong. You could be the perfect park manager and be completely missing out on an entire section of society, and you are. This is happening. It's been happening every day since the creation of the National Park Service. It's changing, but it's still happening, right? Oh, we don't do this. We never did this. We don't talk about going to your park and doing whatever activities you're starting to uncover there, because that's not something any of us have ever done. We don't even think about it. We just don't. I mean, maybe we know about it as a concept, but it's just not something we ever have identified with, seen in ourselves. And then there's also the sense of, okay, well, for folks who are descended from enslaved people here in the United States, right? So the Civil War ended about 150 years ago, and there are still echoing effects of things like your ancestors having or not having, as a function of being previously enslaved, the ability to send you to college without absolutely ginormous loans. Or the sense in that family of, we are a family that values education because that's in reach for us, and most of us have done it and just sailed right through. Okay? That's called the marginality hypothesis. Third and finally, there is an outright racism hypothesis of, remember Rebecca, a fellow grad student up at the University of Vermont. She said, you know, to my older generations in my family, the woods are where black people go to get hanged. And that's still in living memory, like a lynching a day for older melanated people. So why wouldn't they think of your forested national park as a place where black people get disappeared? Now, that may not be true. The murder rate across the entire United States National Park System, with close to 300 million visitor days per year, sorry. So 300 million people entering a front gate somewhere across a year, across the entire National Park System. The murder rate across the park system is very closely equal to the murder rate in Carbondale. You're a hell of a lot safer in any of these national parks than you are in this classroom right now. But if it doesn't feel like that, like if the stories that are handed down in your family don't sound like the stories handed down in my family, where, guys, my last name is Park. I go camping a lot. Generations of parks have gone to parks, right? We go hard on that. But for other folks where their story is pretty different, it kind of makes sense for them. And so it can become not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the perception defining the reality. Because if the perception is, this is a place full of racists, and national parks are overrepresented with white people, and some brown people have experienced some racism from some white people, right? We can see how this would be kind of a hard filter, a hard sort out for a lot of people who are otherwise absolutely entitled to enjoy all the things that somebody who's never had to worry about racism or running at night or being trapped on an island with a man instead of a bear. Okay? Does all that make sense? All right, these are some sensitive topics, so I want to treat them with kindness and heart and a lot of seriousness. Does anybody have any questions about these basic social correlates or characteristic identifiers of your recreationists, your visitors, your users showing up with or without other groups of people like it, and things that tend to be true about groups of those recreationists showing up together on purpose? Any questions? All right, cool. So, your assignment for Wednesday, read chapter 2 of Studies in Outdoor Recreation. It starts talking about some of this stuff, chapter 2 and 3, but just for now, read chapter 2. It's pretty dense. So give yourself space and time to maybe read through it once, think about it, take another look at it before Wednesday. And head back to your national parks website and start to get any sense that you can from not just the individual users and their specific activities, as was due for today, but what kinds of folks are showing up. In order to do that, you may need to dig into the management and science section of the website for your national park and look for things like the visitor management plan. That's going to have a lot of info about who's visiting your park historically and who they think is about to visit your park as these trends change over time, right? So Caucasians, light-skinned folks are about to become the majority minority in the American population real soon now if it hasn't happened yet. So still the largest skin color group, but no longer more than 50% of the total population, including everybody. Okay? So these things are changing. Start to take a look at how things are changing at your park. Cool? All right. Cool. So this information is not going to be collected in a single spot. It's going to be in different documents for different parks. But start to take a look at that management and science section of your national park and take a look at what documents are available. General management plan, trails plan, visitor management plan, all these different names for approximately adjacent things. I'm around for questions. I'll sign a few minutes early. Sorry we were inside today, but it's hot and disgusting outside, so hopefully this worked a little bit better than otherwise. Thanks. Hang out for questions if you have them.